Hello, and today we're going to have a look through Switzerland and Germany. Switzerland, I'm afraid we're only going to give the briefest view to. The simple reason for that is we just don't see very much of it in the UK. Partly it's because the standard of living is so high in Switzerland that the costs translate to very expensive wine, and then when small volumes are exported over here, it tends to be correspondingly high compared to a similar quality wine from elsewhere. They're really worth trying if you're in Switzerland. I think they make some fantastic wines, but only 1% of their production is exported. The main grapes are Pinot Noir for reds and Chasselas. There's also about 200 varieties grown there, lots of French varieties, Pinot Blancs, Merlots and so forth, but practically speaking it's mostly Pinot Noir and Chasselas that you'll see. They also allow chaptalization in Switzerland, which is the addition of sugar, and this boosts the alcohol content and the impression of body in the wines, so they're a little bit fuller bodied than you might expect from such a cool climate. And they also encourage the malolactic fermentation, which is it softens the acidity in the wine, so they're a little bit more approachable than some of the austere, arguably, and steely German wines that we'll come to look on in a minute. The vineyards across Switzerland are stunningly beautiful, as most of the country is itself. It's very pastoral. I think that's reflected in the style of the wines as well, but practically speaking, most of the wines are produced in the west of the country. 2/3 of it is produced in Valais, Vaud and Geneva, and most of the regions have AOC status, which is similar to the French appellation rules on which they're based. Germany has some reasonably complex wine rules, and I only really want to outline them. I don't want to get too bogged down in them because they're a little bit more complicated, I think, than they need to be. Plus they've got some other categories that they've added on as well, which don't have any legal status but are useful for sort of identifying some of the top wines from the country. The most basic is Deutsche Wein, basically German wine, and then Deutsche Landwein, which is similar to the old French Vin de Pays, it's country wine. Neither of these categories you'll really see outside of Germany, but they might be useful if you're in Germany, and you can then differentiate between quite the basic wine and slightly more better quality wine. What is called Deutsche Qualitätswein, German quality wine, is more region specific, has slightly more stringent rules on the way wine is made. But then at the top of the tree there's Deutsche Qualitätswein mit Prädikat, and this is quality wine with specific attributes. So it's got minimum sweetness levels, acidity levels and various things to let you know that the wine you're getting is of a particular category and style. Now this starts with Kabinett, which is the lightest style, Spätlese, which is late harvest literally, which can be dry but anything up to sweet, and they can be quite age-worthy. After this you have Auslese, which is riper again, can include some botrytized grapes, so it can be anything from the sort of medium to the sweeter end of the spectrum. Beerenauslese, which is from partially to mainly botrytized grapes, so this can be very sweet. Then there's another category which is Eiswein, which is made very late harvest. The vines literally freeze, and all the water in the grapes freeze, so that when you squeeze them, what you get out is all the really, really concentrated grape juice, sugars and all the flavours from the wine. Mostly botrytized as well, but Eiswein is really, you get tiny amounts of it, but it's really concentrated and very sweet. And then at the very top, Trockenbeerenauslese, basically the quality wines, the names get longer as you go along, which is quite common in German, which is hand-picked, fully botrytized grapes, and they can be very sweet. Superb dessert wines. Above all of this, at the top, there's the Erste Lager, which is similar to a Premier Cru status, and Großes Gewachs. Now these are awarded sort of within the German wine community. There's no legal definition, but they're a useful way of identifying who are the top producers if you see that on a label. There's a few other terms you may see on a wine label. German, unless you speak it, can be quite an impenetrable language. Trocken, which is dry. Halbtrocken, medium dry. There's other terms like Weingut or Weinkellerei, which is just a wine producer, which could be Ernst Lüssen, or it could be the name of the estate itself. Gutsabfüllung or Erzeugerabfüllung, that basically means filled at the estate, a bit like Chateau bottled. It's a designation that can indicate a better quality wine. Now, Germany's reputation did suffer as a result of a lot of rather bland, insipid wine, particularly after the war. There was a lot of wines produced in Müller-Thurgau, a lot of brands like Black Tower, Blue Nun, and at the time these were actually indicative, a bit like Matthias Rosé, of these brands were better quality than a lot of the wines that were coming in, unfortunately. So they became quite popular, but then as taste changed, these sort of rather bland, low acidity wines, mostly made from Müller-Thurgau or Germanic style wines like Lachsky Riesling, A lot of these quality Rieslings came to be sort of lumped in with them as this rather old-fashioned bland wines. And I'm glad to say that, you know, with some of the more traditional merchants, they've never really fallen out of favour, but there's a bit more of a resurgence of interest in them, particularly as we're seeing more Asian and Asian fusion foods which work really well with these styles of wines. There's also in Germany a research institute at Geisenheim, which from the 1890s onwards produced lots of cool climate grapes, either crossings or hybrid grapes, some of which suit our climate really well as Germany's, so things like Müller-Thurgau, Bacchus, Rondo, Regent, they all came from this area. And some of them can be good, but generally they're not seen at the top quality level. The main two grapes in Germany, for me and for most people, are Riesling and Pinot Noir, particularly in the quality area. There's a few other local specialities which are really interesting. We don't see them here, but as we go through the regions, I'll mention them because they're well worth seeking out. Riesling is uniquely suited to Germany. It works in lots of other areas, the Clare Valley, but it takes a very long time to ripen compared to other varieties, 120 to 130 days. If you compare that to a red variety, Cabernet Sauvignon in Bordeaux, it's 105 to 115. You'd expect it to be the other way around, that the red would need far more ripening. The flip side of this is that Riesling doesn't like it too hot, so you want lots of sunshine but not too much heat. So across Germany and across the world, you find that Riesling suits slightly higher altitude sites or cool sites in south-facing, often quite steep, almost amphitheatre-like bends in the river, so that they get the maximum amount of sunshine. Even quite late in the year, that really low sun can ripen them right through to the autumn, so you get that full ripeness, but a lovely delicate acidity as well. And there are very few countries other than Germany that have that kind of topography, particularly on the rivers. The Moselle, which we're coming on to next, is a region more than any other that's synonymous with quality and Riesling. Moselle, or to include its two tributaries, Moselle Saar Ruwer, which is, you might see on some labels, which indicates wine from the whole area rather than the central Moselle itself. Slate soils here dominate the area, particularly alongside the river, and in some areas the poles are dug directly into the rock that the vines are anchored on, and they're really useful because you actually need to hold on to them when you're picking the grapes or pruning the grapes there. The slopes are really that steep. In some areas they've actually got funicular railways going up and down to take the workers up and down, because otherwise you'd need crampons and picks to climb some of the vineyards. The Middle Moselle is where most of the famous vineyards and villages cluster. The sundials, or Sonnenuhr, are the indication that these are the vineyards that get the most sunshine. The most famous ones are in Veiling, Zeltingen and Brauneberg. Veiling Sonnenuhr, for example, is one of Ernst Lüsen's best known bottlings. The slate here gives the wine a really smoky minerality. This isn't directly from the slate, it's more a function of the fact that the slate is so free draining, it's like a sieve, the rain goes straight through it, so the grapes have to put their roots down extremely deep, which means they draw up lots of different nutrients that gives the wine that lovely smoky minerality that's unique to this area. So the first one we're going to try is from AJ Adden, which is quite a modern sort of pioneering producer in the Middle Moselle. They call it their Riesling Feinherb. Feinherb is a term, has no legal definition, but it just means medium dry. But it has a slightly looser meaning than Haupttrocken. It covers a slightly wider range of wines. This is only 10.5% alcohol. It's beautifully floral and delicate. There's that lovely lemony lime blossom. The first thing that really hits you is the acidity, but it's not acid like vinegar. It's balanced beautifully with that slightly honeyed, lovely off-dried texture. With that residual sweetness, it's not at all cloying. The acidity just holds everything together. It's an absolutely beautiful wine, very precise. This would be wonderful as an aperitif. I could drink this all night long. It's a very drinkable wine, but it's a very food-friendly wine as well. If you think of that Asian fusion or Asian food I was talking about earlier, this would work really well with Korean pork belly, with the vegetable biryani, with their sort of delicate aromatic spices. It's a really, really great wine. Noir, if Moselle is all about slate, the Noir is where there's a greater diversity of soil types, lots of different ones, so you get a greater diversity of flavours in the wine. There's sort of basalt soils, clay in some areas, some clay marl, all of which suit different grapes. But where Riesling is planted, it really reflects the nature of the vineyard more than any other. That's why the slate in these vineyards here really sings through. And in Noir you'll find that depending on where the vineyard is, you'll get lots of different flavours, particularly in Riesling, but in lots of other wines as well. But we're trying another Riesling now. And interestingly, with this Riesling, it is actually labelled dry rather than trocken, which shows for me that it's aimed squarely at the UK market. The other thing you'll notice is I've left them on deliberately. A lot of these wines are screw capped. I'm a big fan of screw caps for wine. I think the wine ages perfectly well under them. If you wanted to age either of these Rieslings, I wouldn't want to see them in 20 or 30 years time, but they can certainly develop with that lovely acidity and balance of sweetness. They can certainly age, I think, for at least 4 or 5 years and develop really interesting flavours, and they can do that perfectly well under screw cap. Cork taint is much more noticeable on delicate wines like this, so I'm very happy to see them under a screw cap. Slightly higher alcohol, because don't remember, all of that sweetness has been fermented fully dry, so this is 11.5%, still quite light, so it's a lovely delicate wine. And again, it's got that lovely Riesling character, bags of acidity, a little bit more towards lime perhaps than lemon than the previous wine. It's a much leaner wine because of that lack of sweetness there. It does make it a slightly more versatile food wine. You could have this with all sorts of different fish dishes, poultry. It's a little more versatile. This, I think, works with lots of different foods, but this is perhaps more acceptable if you're not that familiar with the off-dry wines. This is more of an entry-level Riesling, if you're a bit more used to Sauvignon Blanc and that kind of thing. Rheinhessen next is the largest region, and it accounts for a quarter of Germany's output. And again, it has a huge diversity. It's a much bigger area, lots of different soil types. So again, you're getting much more diversity of flavours. Riesling and Pinot Noir still dominate here, but there's also a lot of Silvaner, a grape that hasn't really caught our attention in the UK, but it can be great. But we'll see that in the next region, which is the more traditional region that comes from. Rheinhessen's by far the largest region, with a quarter of Germany's output, and it has a great diversity of soil types again, so you get a great diversity of different styles. Riesling and Pinot Noir again dominate, and they're excellent here, but there's a bit more, there's lots of other different varieties here as well. Pinot Blanc, Pinot Grigio as well, a little bit of that, Scheurebe. There's also a lot of Silvaner planted here, a grape that hasn't really caught our attention in the UK yet, but I'll mention that when we come on to another region later. Pfalz borders Alsace and naturally enough has a similar, fairly dry, moderate climate and produces largely similar wines to Alsace. The Rieslings here are less edgy than those from the Moselle, for example. There's slightly more peach fruit, less green apple tartness, so there's a little bit more warmth and fruit in the wines. Scheurebe for whites, Pinot Noir again for reds, and there's a local speciality called Portugieser, which can make a slightly tart, light, fruity red, a bit like a Frappato, I suppose, having not tried them side by side, but there's a similarity there. It also makes an excellent rosé. Hessische Bergstrasse, tiny area, good quality, making noteworthy Pinot Noir and Riesling again. Franken, it's a little too cool even for Riesling. Bacchus and Silvaner perform slightly better here. Silvaner is traditionally from this area, and the traditional bottle is a Boxbeutel, which is similar to a Mateus Rosé bottle. They stack terribly and they don't fit in wine racks, but that's the traditional bottle that's made here. Silvaner can be bland, but like Chasselas, if its yields are kept down and it's vinified properly, it can make an elegant and interesting wine. Circling back for our last wine to the Rheingau, we have a Spatburgunder or Pinot Noir from Weinhaus Ress. Now, I can already see in the bottle the colour of this is very light, which is what you would expect from a cool climate Pinot. Really light in colour. I mean, Pinot always is, but you can tell it's from a cool climate, England or in this case Germany. That's a real giveaway. It's got lovely Pinot character, lots of fruit in there as well. It's lovely red currant fruit. Again, red currant for me tells me it's a Pinot Noir from a cool climate. That and the acidity, which is really biting at my mouth at the moment. Lovely fruit character. A little bit of creaminess as well. It might have had some time in oak. I'm not getting a lot of new oak from it, but it's got that lovely sort of balance between the fruit and the savoury character. A great food wine, not just because of the acidity, it's just got bags of character in there. This would be lovely with poached salmon, lightly chilled, with a little bit of hollandaise. It's a really beautiful Pinot Noir, and it's indicative of the quality of some of the wines from Germany. And I hope you've enjoyed this little quick overview through the Germanic countries, and next time we'll be heading off to Austria and Hungary. And I'll see you then. Thank you.